This is an essay in the series After the Walls Come Down, Building New Institutions from the Remains of a Broken World by William Young.
Ask most Americans to define democracy, and they invariably talk about a system in which citizens can vote in free elections. The importance of voting is overrated in many respects and underrated in others. George Bernard Shaw, a committed equalitarian, had little faith that the right to vote could lead to a democratic society. In his book Everybody's Political What's What, Shaw wrote, quote, "Democracy means the organization of society for the benefit and at the expense of everybody indiscriminately, and not for the benefit of a privileged class. A nearly desperate difficulty in the way of its realization is the delusion that the method of securing it is to give votes to everybody, which is the one certain way of defeating it." Unquote. According to Shaw's definition, democracy is a condition rather than a process, performance-based rather than prescription-based. Most countries have elections and allow people to vote, but few, if any, have truly democratic governments. Voting can be important for symbolic reasons. The right to vote is one official way that a society acknowledges citizenship and says it trusts people enough to choose who will make important government decisions. Shaw refers to the benefits and expenses of living in a democracy. The only way democracy can succeed is if the social expenses incurred when citizens conform with the rules are in balance with the benefits citizens believe they are receiving. This concept of a bargain between citizens and their government became prominent during the Enlightenment in the 1700s, but it has been around since ancient times. The main body of the U.S. Constitution says little about voting. The Founding Fathers left most considerations about voting to the states. Not until the 20th century, and in some cases the second half of the 20th century, did the United States make a significant commitment to expanding the franchise. At various times, women, African Americans, the poor, immigrants, the young, convicted felons, and other groups have been excluded from voting, and some still are. The hundreds of thousands of citizens living in the District of Columbia continue to be denied voting representation in Congress. Many American citizens are living with a government that their group had no say in designing. The Constitution might have been different if women, African Americans, Indians, and the poor had been included in writing it. Ideally, governments should reach decisions by consensus, which is an agreement in which few people get exactly what they want, but everyone gets something they can live with. Consensus is not the same as majority rule. Communities in which everyone knows most of their neighbors are more likely to be able to reach consensus. American politics in the 21st century has increasingly become an exercise in which people draw lines in the sand and try to prevail over those with opposing views. Even in small communities, an increasing number of people now are drawing lines because of the political climate of the country. As jurisdictions become larger, reaching consensus becomes ever more difficult. When people no longer know their neighbors, they are more likely to be suspicious and distrustful. In a country such as the United States, with a population of well over 300 million, people might know only an infinitesimal number of their neighbors, and they are more likely to believe negative stories they hear about people and groups they do not know and might never know. If anything goes wrong in their lives, they might become angry and blame the others. The others might have a different skin color or religion, or come from a different country or socioeconomic group. Many politicians exploit these feelings against otherness, which results in greater divisiveness. Some people believe that government should be run more like a business, even though governments have very different purposes and structures than businesses. Governments exist to serve the needs of people, and they are mostly financed by tax revenues rather than by selling goods and services. They are supposed to operate with the consent of the governed. Businesses are authoritarian organizations whose purpose is to make money. Their bosses dictate how they operate, including who is hired and who is fired. The President of the United States is not the CEO of the government. When the MAGA regime took over in 2025, Americans experienced what can happen when government is run like a business. The ruthlessness of the business-oriented MAGA regime has appalled many people in America and other parts of the world. Politics in America is a combative sport in which parties and interest groups use any available tactics, fair or unfair, to try to vanquish their opponents. The Democrats are trying to win primarily by using tactics regarded as fair in the political world. The MAGA regime is employing as many unfair tactics as it can get away with, and it is having much more success. Still, for both parties, winning is all that matters. To the victors belong the government spoils, and if you're not on the winning side, tough luck. The notion of government being for the benefit and at the expense of everybody indiscriminately never enters the minds of most political combatants. Democracy in America is mostly an abstraction celebrated on the 4th of July rather than the way existing federal, state, and local governments operate. The United States, like most other countries, is facing enormous problems that need immediate attention. The problems cannot be addressed if the government is dominated by parties constantly at loggerheads, with each trying to undo, when the government changes hands, whatever the other party had put in place. The result is political gridlock, and inactivity suits the anti-government MAGA regime just fine. Some countries have 3 or more parties at loggerheads. The French philosopher Simone Weil wrote an essay called On the Abolition of All Political Parties. Her short life lasted from 1909 to 1943, and the essay was published posthumously in 1950. They wrote that political parties are organizations that exist to exert collective pressure on the minds of their members, and that the first objective and ultimate goal of any political party is its own growth, without limit. Once power is achieved, no amount will ever be deemed sufficient. They said political parties are propaganda machines, and the purpose of propaganda is to persuade, not to impart light. In a democracy, legislators need to be able to vote for what they think is right, not simply according to a party line. They asked readers to imagine if a member of a party were to make the following commitment, quote, "Whenever I shall have to examine any political or social issue, I swear I will absolutely forget that I am the member of a certain political group. My sole concern will be to ascertain what should be done in order to best serve the public interest and justice." Unquote. She said the party member would be accused of betrayal and asked why he had joined the party in the first place. They said that when joining a political party, one gives up the idea of only serving the public interest and pursuing justice. Weil's analysis applies to current Republican legislators who receive death threats and/or are threatened with being primaried, having the party finance the campaign of a primary opponent in the next election, if they do not vote for what the MAGA president wants. A model for the fascist mentality is the story of Alexander the Great and the Gordian knot. Gordium, in present-day Turkey, had a complicated knot tied to a cart, and a legend said that whoever could untie it would rule Asia. When Alexander saw the knot, he sliced through it with his sword. He used brute force rather than taking the time to figure out how to untie the knot. Modern-day fascists are waving their figurative swords and using brute force to destroy institutions they cannot be bothered to try to understand. The speed and effectiveness with which the MAGA sword is slicing through government and social institutions is as breathtaking as it is frightening. As the fascists have become more dominant in the U.S., the Democratic Party has shown itself to be either incapable or unwilling to offer more than token resistance. The insatiable thirst for power by parties has led to an insatiable thirst for money to finance political activities. Campaigning has become very expensive, and the cost has become a barrier to entry for many potential candidates. Seats in the House and Senate now are contested by people willing to toe the party line or who are rich enough to finance their own campaigns. In elections for federal and state offices, the electorate is only one constituency about which candidates are concerned, and typically not the most important one. The most important constituencies for most candidates are the lobbying organizations, corporate donors, and wealthy individuals who finance the campaigns. These constituencies represent interests from all over the country, and sometimes the world, rather than only the state or district where the election is held. The electorate is now considered an obstacle that must be overcome in periodic elections so that legislators can continue to serve the outside donors paying for the campaigns. Fundraising becomes a never-ending job, with candidates raising money for the next campaign as soon as the previous one is decided. Media outlets report the amounts of money raised by competing candidates as if this somehow might indicate their ability to govern rather than being an indication of the extent to which they might be beholden to special interest groups. The problem of money in politics is connected with the much bigger problem of wealth inequality. Democracy cannot exist if rich people exert undue influence over who will be elected, nor can democracy exist in a country where corporations are regarded as people, as they are after the 2010 Supreme Court decision in the Citizens United v. Federal Election Commission case. The ruling allows corporations and other organizations to contribute unlimited amounts of money to political candidates. To paraphrase George Orwell, it is clear when looking at the power wielded in elections by rich segments of American society that some animals are more equal than others. During the 21st century, America has been an example for how fascism can take root with little opposition. The circumstances are different from what happened in Germany, Italy, and Spain during the first half of the 20th century, but the results are similar. Before the MAGA regime took over, commentators were reluctant to use the word fascist, even though MAGA ideology is clearly fascist. Pundits and writers claim that what the MAGA adherents want is not exactly what Hitler, Mussolini, or Franco wanted. The fascism in Italy, where fascism began, Germany, where it had its most toxic and deadly form, and Spain were all different, but it was all fascism, and the similarities were much more important than the differences. To understand how fascism came to the United States without much protest, one can turn to the political analysis of Michael Jordan, formerly of the Chicago Bulls. He later made a fortune endorsing athletic shoes for Nike. Jordan is an African American from North Carolina. When asked why he did not endorse the African American Democratic candidate Harvey Gantt, who was running against the racist incumbent Republican Senator Jesse Helms in the 1990 North Carolina Senate election, Jordan replied, "Republicans buy sneakers too." The reply sometimes is recounted as, "Republicans buy shoes too." Jordan's reply mirrors the attitude of most of the mass media. Media moguls want to attract money from advertisers, and content is created to attract people to ads. When the electorate has a deep divide between Republicans and Democrats, which has become much deeper since Jordan's reply, many media outlets do not want to risk losing a large portion of their audience by favoring one side or the other. Instead, they walk a tightrope and produce content that upsets as few people as possible. This applies to news content as well as other content. As a result, the media will not use the word fascist lest they upset fascists in the electorate. Instead, they use a term such as populist, which sounds much friendlier, like popular. Fascists are portrayed as colorful people whose outrageous actions are an attempt to convey legitimate populist concerns. Meanwhile, people who oppose the fascists keep watching and commiserate with their friends. Can you believe what they did today? In this way, the audience stays intact, and the fascists and non-fascists continue to watch commercials for shoes and other items advertised by the corporations financing the media outlet. The media landscape in America has been dramatically changing. Traditional sources of political news, such as television, radio, newspapers, and magazines, have become much less important, while the internet, especially videos, and social media have become much more important. Nobody has to walk a tightrope regarding the content posted on the newer sources, and the cost of entry is cheap. The newer media have few or no editors or filters, which means the political information they promulgate is very difficult to police. Some of the misinformation comes from people and entities in foreign countries. Political organizations now can mine data and target messages to different cohorts and individuals, which has revolutionized campaigning and bodes ill for the prospects of democracy. With the rise of fascism in the United States during the 21st century, many of the gains in voting rights are being eroded. White MAGA males realize that their share of eligible voters is declining. Rather than working with the changing electorate, they are trying to retain power by restricting voting by groups they think will vote against them. For the century between the end of the Civil War and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, voter suppression was widely practiced by Southern Democrats who thought Negroes should not be allowed to vote. Voter suppression now is practiced almost exclusively by far-right MAGA adherents who hope to be able to stay in power despite having the support of less than half of eligible voters. More than half the states in the country have passed restrictive voting laws. Voting is being suppressed by gerrymandering, demanding photo identification, intimidation at polling places, restricting the number of polling places, making voting less convenient, striking eligible voters from voting rolls, and many other means. In 2019, the Transformative Justice Coalition in Washington published a list of 72 methods of voter suppression being practiced. MAGA supporters in national and state legislatures and others who support voter suppression defend their actions by saying they are trying to end widespread voter fraud, even though they have produced scant credible evidence that such fraud exists. The real reason is that they are more interested in retaining power than promoting democracy. Throughout history, countless people have interfered with the electoral process to try to preserve or enhance their power. Democracy is damaged more when the franchise is overly restrictive or non-existent than when it is broadly inclusive. Voter suppression in the United States has been practiced from the early days of the country. Elbridge Gerry, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, later served as vice president under James Madison, one of the primary drafters of the Constitution. While governor of Massachusetts, Gerry signed legislation to redraw the state's voting districts. A Boston newspaper thought one oddly shaped district resembled a salamander, which gave rise to the portmanteau word gerrymander to describe the drawing of voting districts for partisan advantage. Gerrymandering is still widely used to restrict government representation for minorities and members of parties not in power, with the 2025 shenanigans in Texas being one of many examples. Gerrymandering has also been used to perpetuate segregation in school districts. The U.S. Constitution has a clause, Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, which has since been superseded, which says that each slave counts as 3/5 of a person for determining taxation, seats in the House of Representatives, and electoral college votes. Slave owners from the South wanted slaves to be counted as full people who could not vote. Northerners, such as Elbridge Gerry, believed slaves should not be counted at all because they were property, like cattle and horses. Around the same time, American Indians also were considered to be less than full people. In the Declaration of Independence, in which Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, he referred to, quote, merciless Indian savages, unquote. For governing purposes, Jefferson did not consider Indian savages to be equals. For democracy to work, government should be inclusive and something citizens want to participate in because it is important to their lives. Some countries have compulsory voting laws. The United States does not, and while various political groups are protesting about voter suppression, a significant portion of the electorate does not vote by choice. Since the end of World War II, no candidate in a presidential election has ever received more popular votes than the number of eligible voters who chose not to vote. The turnout for U.S. elections is even lower in years with no presidential race. Something is seriously wrong with a system in which many eligible voters choose not to vote, while some eligible people who want to vote are barred from doing so. America uses a first-past-the-post system to determine election winners, the candidates with the highest vote totals, instead of having proportional representation, which assigns legislative seats based on the percentage of votes a party receives. The first-past-the-post system gives undue influence to large political parties while silencing minority voices. For instance, suppose you have a party whose views represent a seventh of the population. If none of their candidates are able to achieve the highest vote total in any legislative election, the party will receive no seats in Congress. This means their views will not be heard in Senate and House debates, even though they represent 1 out of every 7 members of the electorate. Almost this exact situation occurred in the 2024 elections in the United Kingdom, which also has a first-past-the-post system. The UK House of Commons has 650 seats. The Reform UK party, headed by the MAGA clone Nigel Farage, received about 1 out of every 7 votes cast in the election. If the UK had proportional representation, Reform UK would have received 92 or 93 seats in the House of Commons. Instead, they received 5. The Labour Party, which was the big winner in the election, took 411 seats in the House of Commons, about 63%, even though Labour candidates received only 33.7% of the national votes. In other words, Labour received less than 2.5 times the number of votes as Reform UK, but they received more than 80 times the number of seats. Labour previously held only 202 seats, even though their percentage in the total national votes in the 2020 elections had been 32.1%, less than 2% lower than in 2024. The U.S. Founding Fathers had legitimate concerns about a few large states being able to dictate what the nation's laws should be. Their solution was to create a system which now gives small states undue power in the federal government. The most glaring example is the composition of the Senate, which allots 2 senators to each state, regardless of how big or small the state is. In 2024, California had an estimated population of close to 40 million, and it has 2 votes in the Senate. The 20 smallest states combined had a smaller population than California, but they have 40 votes in the Senate. The Senate determines not only what laws will be passed, but also who will serve as judges on the Supreme Court and other federal courts, and who will serve as the top figures in federal agencies and departments. All these positions need to be ratified by the Senate, but not the House of Representatives. Small states also have an advantage in determining who is elected president. The Electoral College gives greater influence to small states than to large ones because the number of electors from each state is the sum of their senators and representatives in Congress. The 20 smallest states by population have 79 electoral votes, while California, with a larger population than the smallest 20 combined, has only 54. In a number of presidential elections, the candidate with the most Electoral College votes did not receive the most popular votes. Selecting the president through the Electoral College means that voters who live in states considered either safe or lost by the 2 major parties are not likely to receive visits or much attention from presidential candidates. The candidates will spend most of their efforts trying to attract voters from swing states whose totals in the Electoral College could make a difference in determining who wins. Voters in the safe or lost states have less incentive to vote if they know their vote has no chance of influencing the election outcome. The widespread use of public opinion polls also helps to reduce voter turnout. If pollsters say a candidate in an important election has a big lead, some people might not bother to go to the polls because their vote will make little difference in the outcome. The word candidate is derived from the Latin canditatus, which means white-robed. In ancient Rome, men seeking public office used to wear white togas, often brightened with chalk, as a symbol of the purity of their intentions. Modern candidates no longer wear white togas, and their intentions are rarely pure. It is obvious when listening to politicians that many do not believe what they are saying. They parrot what political consultants tell them to say. Most candidates take speaker training courses to learn techniques for bridging to subjects they want to talk about if asked about something they do not want to talk about. Reforming such a deeply entrenched system in such a deeply divided nation would be extremely difficult. Some changes could be accomplished through legislation if there is the political will to take action. Other changes would require amending the Constitution. Constitutional amendments are highly unlikely to be passed in a divided country because they require a 2/3 vote in both the Senate and the House, and then approval by 3/4, or 38, of the state legislatures. Some people have floated the idea of calling a constitutional convention to rewrite portions of the Constitution, but this would be very dangerous in a period with so much political division. The nation would most likely end up with a much worse constitution than it has now. George Bernard Shaw thought voting was not compatible with democracy because most people intensely dislike being taxed, strongly object to being dictated to by government officials, and dread being governed at all. Shaw's analysis is consistent with the results of America's 2024 elections, in which voters elected many candidates who do not believe in either democracy or the concept of government. If you look at a map of the United States showing which counties in 2024 voted Republican, red, versus Democrat, blue, the country appears to be a sea of red, with blue dots interspersed where urban areas are located and some blue marks along the coasts. Most of the blue states contain a lot of red counties. The red areas are some of the places that have suffered the most from globalization and the increasing inequality of income and wealth. A lot of the discontent is not as much Democrat versus Republican as urban versus non-urban. Because the mass media, the financial world, and countless other parts of American life have a strong urban bias, many people in non-urban areas feel neglected. If you include factors such as the movement of jobs overseas and the wealth and income inequality that has become substantially more pronounced, you have a recipe for significant discontent and social unrest. The unrest has been building for decades, and it is one reason why, when the MAGA regime assumed power in 2025, the president wanted to send troops into cities such as Washington, Los Angeles, and Chicago to teach the urban bastards a lesson. Another reason is that these cities are strongly democratic. The American dream says that anyone who works hard can be successful and live a comfortable life. Children are expected to grow up and be more successful than their parents. Immigrants who come to the country can get onto the bottom rung of the economic ladder, which is usually better than where they came from, and with hard work are able to make a decent life for themselves and their children. The American dream no longer exists for large segments of the population. Because so much money is concentrated at the top of the wealth and income distributions, many Americans now are working hard but not living a successful and comfortable life. Many children are not doing better than their parents, and a good number are returning home to live with their parents because they cannot afford housing on their own. Immigrants are still working hard and doing a lot of jobs Americans no longer want to do. Many immigrants are not paid much, yet they still send money to their families in the countries from which they came. The American dream is more alive for them, but now they have to deal with the intense anti-immigrant anger which has swept the country. A rough estimate of the American electorate is that about a third votes for Democrats, a third votes for Republicans, and about a third could swing either way. The MAGA president won his first term in 2016 when part of the uncommitted third swung in his favor to replace an African American Democratic president. Part of the uncommitted third swung away from the MAGA president in 2020, and the former Democratic vice president was elected. In 2024, part of the uncommitted third swung away from the Democrats and elected the MAGA president again. In 2028, the uncommitted third could just as easily swing away from the MAGA president and elect another Democrat. It is possible that there will be enough anger about the activities of the MAGA regime that they will be voted out of office, if the elections will be held as scheduled and will be conducted fairly, which are big ifs. When political pundits analyze elections, they typically focus on the economy, social issues, or which candidate performed better in debates. They rarely talk about racism and sexism, which is widespread and can make other factors inconsequential. One reason for the intense anger of the MAGA supporters is that many are white supremacists who have not recovered from having a nigger in the White House for 8 years. Their blood must boil in the wake of the George Floyd murder when they see commercials featuring so many people of color, including people in interracial marriages. This is why one of the first things the racist MAGA president did when he regained the White House in 2025 was to eliminate government DEI programs, diversity, equity, and inclusion. He much prefers UIE, uniformity, inequity, and exclusion. He also is trying to erase any government mentions of slavery and the Civil War. The 2024 election showed that MAGA supporters are not the only racists and sexists. A lot of non-MAGA racists and sexists voted against their own interests. The presidential election was contested between a dark-skinned woman and a male white racist felon. Some Hispanic men voted for the white racist felon because they did not want the country to be led by a woman, especially a woman of color, even though they and their families were put into jeopardy when ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents, began to round up Hispanics, both citizens and non-citizens. Some African American voted for the white racist felon because they did not want the president to be a woman of color, even though the felon has white supremacist ties and has eliminated programs designed to redress wrongs done to African Americans throughout history. Some women did not want to vote for another woman, even though the alternative has resulted in more discrimination and violence against women. And many fundamentalist Christians who stress family values voted for the felon who has been married 3 times and consorts with strippers and sex traffickers. The situation of presidents trying to undo whatever their predecessors put in place reminds me of the Buddhist concept of samsara, which is a continuous cycle of suffering and rebirth. Just as Buddhists try to escape from the samsara cycle, the goal of the electorate should be to try to escape from this political samsara. There are no cure-alls that will solve all of America's governing problems. The question will be whether the country has enough sane, intelligent, and compassionate people to form a critical mass quickly enough to effect meaningful changes to tear down archaic structures and make governments more representative and able to address urgent problems. The longer governments at all levels remain paralyzed or unable to move forward, the sooner an unpleasant reckoning will occur for climate breakdown and other pressing issues.